You're listening to a CNA podcast.
To the untrained ear, this could be the call of any bird echoing through the trees. But for some, it's unmistakable. The distinctive sound of the straw-headed bulbuls. The worry is we might lose the opportunity to hear them in a near future because these beloved songbirds are highly endangered in Southeast Asia. Habitat loss and poaching threaten their existence, with fewer than 1,700 mature individuals left in the wild worldwide. But there's a glimmer of hope. A dedicated working group in Singapore has emerged to guide conservation efforts and try to ensure the survival of the straw-headed bulbul. This is the Climate Conversations with me, Julie Yu. And today, I've traded the confines of the studio for the serenity of Dairy Farm Nature Park in Singapore, a haven for wildlife enthusiasts. I'm sitting down with the co-chairs of the Straw-headed Bulbul Working Group, Bing Wen from NParks and Alfred Chia from Nature Society Singapore, to delve into the mission of preserving this iconic species. Thank you both for joining me on the Climate Conversations.
Thanks for having us.
You know, I must admit, just hearing straw-headed bulbul, I pictured something exotic and flashy, like parrot or a lorikeet, but I was quite surprised how understated it looks with its simple brown feathers and black beak. I guess you can't judge a bird by its feathers.
Yeah, you could say that. I think like many of the songbirds in Southeast Asia, I would say that the song of the bird itself is much more interesting than how it looks, and conversely, I suppose a parrot or lorikeet, while well endowed visually, isn't as well endowed in terms of their vocals.
Yeah, very raucous.
Yeah, the straw-headed bulbul is most distinguished by their voice. Talk to me about how their voices are unique from other birds or other bulbuls.
So I guess bulbuls in general tend to have very bubbly, cheery calls. So that's typical within the bird family. The same family group sounds similar. What is the most unique aspect of the straw-headed bulbul is the song that the bird makes is not done by a single bird like most other species of bird, but instead the full song actually has both the males and females singing on top of each other to produce that unique effect. So we'll start with playing the iconic song that the bird is famous for.
Okay.
They repeat their own individual pitch, so when you see it in a spectrogram, there is slightly different pitches between the males and females. So this is what the poachers want the most. So usually when they sell the birds, they sell them in a pair, because if you just buy one bird, you only get half the song. So now we go into slightly different territories. We'll start with the cinereous bulbul. So this is a visitor to Singapore. They come over from like Malaysia. I've heard people describe them as a cat meowing, but you can decide that for yourself.
Doesn't sound like a bird.
But this is a bulbul as well. And then last we have the streak bulbul, which is another visitor. It's much more high-pitched than any of those that you have heard before. Some people have described it as sounding a bit like our local squirrels.
They do.
Yeah, it's also related to the straw-headed bulbul. Hopefully you can appreciate is that the straw-headed bulbul being the largest bulbul in Southeast Asia, and also because the song is produced by two individuals, is much more far-carrying than any of the other species.
But the bubbling songs come with a sobering reality check. They are critically endangered globally. I mean, why are these little guys in such peril? What are some of the biggest threats in the region?
So I would say the biggest threat by far is probably trapping for the cage bird trade. Currently, in at least around Southeast Asia, there's still a very high demand for keeping these birds that have very beautiful songs in captivity. So there is a big market for locals to go out there and catch these wild birds for the pet trade. The price of a single individual on, say, like some of the Jakarta bird markets has risen by like 10 times in the last 10 years to around maybe like $2,000.
The beautiful song is actually part of its misfortune, so that's why it's come to be so much poached around this region.
How about their habitats?
I would say from what we know, the straw-headed bulbul isn't very particular about where it lives. In fact, it is perfectly happy in wooded areas in general. It doesn't need like very good forests. And some of what our research seems to suggest is that it also prefers to be close to areas such as like water or certain landforms. So consequently, I think there is ample habitat for the species in the region, but it's more that because there is a lot of demand for its song, there is so much poaching going on that the natural reproductive rate cannot support this level of trapping.
Yeah, I hear there's so few of them in Kalimantan, Indonesia, that it's easier to find an orangutan than these birds. Could you just talk to us about how serious the poaching situation is?
I think in surrounding regions like Kalimantan, Thailand, and probably Malaysia too, it's quite bad to the point that they're almost driven to extinction, extirpated, and you seldom get to hear them or see them as much as you do in Singapore. In places like Thailand and Malaysia, small pockets still exist, but it's not very easily seen. So that's the scale of poaching in those countries, and the efforts to contain them is falling far short of what is needed to protect them.
Let's talk about the Alfred, because out of fewer than 1,700 mature ones, 1/3 of them actually live here in Singapore. So I wonder, why are they doing so well here in Singapore compared to, let's say, like Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar?
Probably in Singapore, it is more well protected, so to say. By and large, the poaching activities are quite controlled, very controlled actually by NParks, and also the vigilance level is quite high in Singapore.
I suppose for us, it has reached a point where globally the global conservation community is aware that Singapore now probably has the best hope of maintaining the species, in the sense that beyond the cases of poaching, which is the primary threatening process for the bird, is very low here. And it's also partly because the society's mindset is different from the surroundings. Like keeping of songbirds for the pet trade or as a hobby is not so entrenched in the society compared to certain areas like Java, for example, where it's a status symbol. So there is this combination where both the society itself appreciates the birds in the wild, as well as that there is no general overwhelming demand for the birds. So I can see how that probably is the greatest difference for us in terms of why the bird is doing so well here compared to our neighbors.
I'm curious, what sort of crucial role does straw-headed bulbul play in its ecosystem?
So I guess you could say that the straw-headed bulbul is slightly different from, say, a tiger, for example, where it doesn't have a very clear-cut role in the ecosystem as an apex predator or something. The bulbul does have an importance in terms of seed dispersal because it eats a fair amount of fruits in the forest, and it also, through its omnivorous diet, also helps with keeping insect populations in check and things like that. But I would say it's more like in the context of whether it's a keystone species, probably not as much as some of the more charismatic wildlife like tigers and wolves, which is part of the reason why one of the goals of our working group is to increase the awareness of this bird, because it's not exactly something that, as you mentioned, will make someone go, wow, it's quite understated for special species.
Let's talk about the efforts, specific efforts that are being made to prevent its extinction.
So we have broadly segregated our roles as co-chairs in the society. Is that on the NSS side, they're more focused on surveys and monitoring as well as the outreach, because that's where they're strongest in. On the NPark side, we do the more technical research, so things like the genetics and the enforcement part, because of the poaching and how it's an international issue where the birds are not exactly being sold in Singapore but in foreign markets. So for us, the parts that we are quite interested to understand at the moment is the genetics of the straw-headed bulbuls, because we haven't made a concerted effort to explore their genetics, and now with the advancements in DNA technology, you can see how related the subpopulations are. So we are currently undertaking research that involves trying to get DNA samples from the various populations of straw-headed bulbuls in our parks and areas that we manage. And then through DNA sequencing out that we can better understand whether they are all interrelated or are they distinct populations, and if so, how can we better connect them together.
So based on the studies that you've done so far, how easy or hard is it to breed them?
They are very difficult to breed in captivity, so that's part of the reason why they are extremely popular in the pet trade, because the supply is very low. You typically can only get them from the wild.
Do you know how much they're being sold in the market?
So a bird which for your average layman villager in Indonesia is a lot of money. On our part, the working group is also privileged to have Mandai Wildlife Group as one of our members. So the zoo is one of the few institutions in Asia that have managed to breed the bulbul in captivity, and even then, to date, they've only had it breed successfully a few times. So I think they've only had a handful of clutches that they have managed to. So what we've established is that it's really hard to generate or to create an insurance population in a controlled environment. So our best hope for conserving the birds is to work in the wild to try to ensure that they stay there.
I see. And Alfred, Bing Wen just mentioned that NSS is in charge of monitoring. Could you just tell us what sort of work that entails?
Basically, one of the subgroup is monitoring and ecology. So we do periodic surveys island-wide where straw-headed bulbul are found. And so with those surveys, data collected, we'll be able to see where the habitats are, what sort of habitats they like, what sort of vegetation density, cover, canopy cover, how high do they go to. And then with all those data, then it'll be useful for us to determine how best to do habitat enhancement where this species occur. So this is one aspect of ecology, to know their habits, where they stay, how they stay, what sort of fruits they like, and what habitat they forage in. Because you need to know what they do and what they like before you can protect them.
Exactly. I think we learned a lot about the struggles and the plight of these endangered birds, the work being done to protect them, even heard them sing. So how about we go out and see if we can find these guys in the wild?
Okay, let's go.
All right, so we just left the education center and now we're strolling through the nature path of the Dairy Farm Nature Park. So just how easy or hard is it to spot these elusive birds?
They are typically far more often seen than heard. So chances are, if you come here in the morning, you would very likely to hear them, but if you want to see them, it might be a bit more tricky.
Maybe describe the location for us. Why is it such an ideal habitat for them?
So based on what we know of straw-headed bulbuls, they tend to like wooded areas close to water. So this pair in Dairy Farm here, they seem to like to hang around this stream that flows along Wallace Path at the bottom of the valley. And consequently, what happens is they spend a lot of time down in the stream, and they would wander up in the mornings to feed on the fruit trees around the building. And then in the late morning, their preference tends to be they tend to go back down into the valley and spend most of the afternoon there.
I mean, there are a lot of brown birds out there. So what are some of the prominent features of straw-headed bulbul?
This is the biggest bulbul in Singapore, but the only difference is that it has got a straw head with some yellow streaks on it.
Okay.
I think that is the distinguishing feature of this bulbul as compared to other bulbuls which you may see here, like the olive wing.
And what do they like to eat, mostly?
So here in particular, they tend to like to eat a lot of fruit, the smaller fruit. So we pass by some trees like the false curry tree that they love to eat. When they are breeding, they might take a lot more insects for more protein and for the chicks to grow. So, but how we would classify them is that typically all bulbuls are considered omnivores, so they eat both plant and animal matter.
Could you share with us some very interesting behaviors that our listeners should know about?
Actually, these bulbuls do come down to the ground to feed. So if you happen to walk by, you may see them on the ground. But if you're up in a tree, you need a very good pair of eyes to be able to see them, unless you have a pair of binoculars.
Okay, and they sing together as duet. Does that mean they're monogamous, or do they have flings?
We don't have a definite answer, but based on ironically anecdotal evidence from trappers, it seems like they are monogamous. So the pairs defend their territory very rigorously. So for example, we know that in this part of Dairy Farm, there is only this particular pair of bulbuls that has been here for many years now. It leads to the interesting tidbit that I wanted to mention was that these bulbuls, they tend to form small family groups after the young fledge. So sometimes towards the end of the season, you see them, the parents being accompanied by, say, both their chicks. And there's a suspicion that probably in the process, that's how the parents imprint the song onto the young birds, but eventually they do get evicted from the prime plot of land and they have to disperse to find their own habitat.
That is so fascinating. Well, here's to hoping we can extend their presence and also hear their beautiful songs for generations to come. Thank you both so much for your time. It's been such an insightful conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I want to end by saying that this is the last episode of the Climate Conversations that I'll be hosting. And over the last 2 seasons, I've had the great privilege of speaking to a wide range of remarkable guests, the people who share their wisdom, passion, and unwavering commitment to make this planet a better one for all of us. Well, this podcast will continue, but with a brand new format, with new segments and new hosts. What won't change is CNA's commitment to help make sense of a very complex problem. So thank you, everyone, for joining me on this incredible journey. And remember, when it comes to confronting the climate crisis, every conversation and every action counts. I'm Julie Yu. Goodbye for now.